Welcome, everyone. Super excited to be kicking off this webinar. For those who've joined us for one of these before, glad to have you back. For those that are new, looking forward to getting to know you better and excited to have this as your first introduction to us and how we think. This is our first webinar of the year, so we're excited to get started with it. We're going to talk about all things climate goal setting, including how this is being done to date, an idea of how we would approach it, some tips and tricks, and we're also going to show you some of our sort of tools and capabilities around this as well. With that, maybe let's start off with introductions. And so right here, you have two of us from Altruistiq. One is me, Saif. I'm the founder and CEO. I've been in the sustainability space for over 20 years now. I started out as an environmental activist. I then worked for the public sector on climate response, energy transition, and a few other areas in Pakistan, where I grew up working for the Prime Minister. I then joined McKinsey, where I spent a long 8 years across multiple locations as part of the sustainability practice. And in that context, I first started helping companies to set climate-related goals or broader sustainability goals, probably around about 2015, 2016, when there were a range of different approaches and benchmarks. SBTI was one of several benchmarks that companies were looking at. It was maybe becoming the dominant one, but was not a clear-cut decision for most companies. And then started Altruistiq about 4 years ago and have obviously been on the journey helping companies work through their targets, data management, achievement of their targets, and so on as well. I want to give you a brief introduction to what we do, and then we'll try and keep the focus on the theme and the topic rather than on Altruistiq. And then I'll also hand over to my colleague, Aron, who can introduce himself. Just by way of a brief introduction to Altruistiq, we are a software company. We have a suite of software solutions, particularly 3 products, all focused on helping companies to set and achieve sustainability goals. The first software product that we have is corporate footprinting, which is focused on scope 1, 2, 3, flag, increasingly methane related measurement as well. And that's the product that pretty much every one of our customers is on with us. And that's a sort of an environmental accounting, standard environmental accounting tracking approach. The second product that we have is our product footprinting solution, which generates product carbon footprints at the level of individual products, individual stock keeping units, for companies that have portfolios of hundreds, thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands of products in their portfolio as well. And then our third product is our supply chain engagement product, which is currently being used by food and beverage companies representing, I think, about 1,500 brands around the world. And that is used to gather or acquire corporate footprints or product carbon footprints from suppliers and incorporate those seamlessly into the corporate footprint or the product footprints on the requestor side. All 3 of our software products are built on the same platform, which means that they're synergistic, work well together, leverage the same databases, and interact with each other as well. With that, let me hand over to Aron to introduce himself as well, and then I'll just give a bit of a sense of what our agenda is for today, and Aron and I will tag team us through the content. Aron, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, thank you, Saif. Hi, I'm Aron. I'm a senior product manager at Altruistiq. I started in the software industry about a decade ago, have been working on sustainability-focused products since 2017. And at Altruistiq, I've been looking after our value chain engagement and decarbonization tools. So my day-to-day is focused on how can we enable companies exchange data on their environmental performance and work together to reduce their impact on the world.
Fantastic. And we're going to cover a few different themes today. We're going to talk a little bit about just climate commitments in general, bearing in mind current trends, politics, and so on. We're going to talk about what we think makes for a good climate goal. And then we're going to focus most of the session around 2 things. One is how would we go about setting a good climate goal? And the final one is addressing your questions and covering Q&A as well. Please do feed through any questions in the Q&A section, and we will do our best to get to all of them as we sort of approach Q&A time as well. With that, we actually also want to maximize engagement with you guys, our audience, and so we have a first question for you, which will help us also baseline where everyone in this group is at right now. So if you could just fill out the poll that's popped up around whether your organization has already set targets. That would be helpful for us in baselining where this group is and tailoring our approach accordingly. I'm going to leave it for just about a minute or less for some of you to fill out the poll, and then I will let Aron take us from there.
What do you make of those results, Seth?
I think the results are actually what I would expect. And so if we're kind of looking at roughly, just over a third have set SBTI targets, almost a third are setting custom targets of some sort. Around a third are thinking about setting a target, and a small percentage or small share are not planning on setting targets anytime soon. I think that's fairly representative. I would actually be very interested to see over time where the third camp lands over the course of this year and whether they land in the SBTI space or in the custom target space. We will get to that, our opinions on that a little later in this webinar. So stay tuned. But I think that's a good baseline for us to start with.
Yes, and absolutely. I think it very much reflects what we see in the market. And 2024 has been a remarkable year because we have seen an insane amount of commitments to SBTI targets. So according to their own reports, there are now 7,000 and something companies with science-based targets, which is close to double of where we were in 2023. And there are also more than 3,000 companies that have some kind of net zero commitments, bringing the total of companies taking some form of action to almost 10,000. And yeah, there has been a lot of controversy. So we would like to hear about what is your view on SBTI targets.
And I'm particularly keen to hear from those who have set SBTI targets, but also those who actually wanted to set their own custom targets. Like it's interesting also to know why you took that approach. And the same goes for anyone who's currently thinking through it. What are your views on this? Uh, I'm intrigued to see the results, which I find actually a little surprising and not what I would have expected. So we have the majority of respondents saying that this is essential for credibility, 65%. We have two camps after that. One is where it's considered too complex to implement, which might explain why some of you have gone for custom targets. And then a smaller group of about two of you who think that it's useful but too rigid, which I think is very close to the too complex camp. Um, I was expecting more individuals to say that it was too ambitious or too expensive. And so that's an interesting contrary view to what I would have expected. We'll come back to this a little later as we talk about complexity, expense, ambition, and also just what the role is for credibility in target setting. But super exciting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this would be heartwarming for SBTI. So what are the main drivers that are leading companies to act? We've been looking at a report from Carbon Direct, and we can see that last year the required emissions disclosures have crept up to third place in the list of main drivers, uh, which means a third of companies mark this as something that's acting them on setting targets. And we think that the main driver behind this is CSRD, which is coming into effect across the European Union. It's being harmonized into national regulation, and it mandates companies to disclose both scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, climate and sustainability risks, which is pretty much what TCFD and the like required previously in non-mandatory reporting. But it also asks to disclose transition and mitigation plans and update transition plans every year and provide details on the progress made on these targets. What
It's
other
It's just
targets?
worth, yeah, it's just actually worth adding, Aaron, that I think other than CSRD, we've seen a lot of momentum over the last few years towards target setting in general, pushed by, I would say, probably two categories of instigator. One is regulation, and that's what we're talking about here. Another is just procurement requirements for large customers of businesses. So if you're B2B, if you're selling, into other businesses, very often you're starting to get requests for targets that are quite specific and quite explicit. One of the ones that we saw come up, which made some waves a few years ago, was PPN 0621 from the UK government, procurement guidelines requiring companies to measure emissions, set targets, publicly disclose targets that the board of directors sign off on. I think there were some entities of the US government as well. I think it was the Ministry of Defense or the Department of Defense that also required companies to set targets. And I know that most of the businesses that we're working with that are asking for emissions data from their suppliers are also asking or requiring that some form of target be set to reduce those emissions as a form of just balancing the liability. If you're a business making commitments, you want your suppliers to match those commitments as well with some form of target. In general, most of those frameworks have not advised a specific type of target, like a specific entity or target validation approach, but they've kind of prescribed what a good target would look like or would entail in terms of process and ambition. And sometimes those land you right alongside SBTI, and sometimes not so clearly.
Yeah, but in addition to all of this progress and target setting wave, there has been a bit of a backlash as well. So SBTI had a tumultuous year with its controversial decision by its board of trustees on carbon offsets, and then the slight walk back from that. And there have also been a few high-profile setbacks on commitments by companies. Saif, which one of these would you think is worth discussing?
I think this is not news for a lot of our listeners or audience. I think what's interesting to see is going to be what happens this year. And I would expect that there are a couple of things that happen this year. One is we see a few more high-profile pullbacks of the kind that we've got up on this slide. So a few big companies, well-established sustainability champions, or otherwise just large incumbents that either formally remove themselves from an SBTI approach or water down their commitment or run late or run behind or something of the sort. I think we'll see more of this. I think it will make headlines, and I think we'll all be somewhat dismayed to see it. I actually don't think that that is the biggest impact from a progress standpoint. And I'll say why. I think the bigger impact is going to be from a sort of a drift of a larger mass of companies that are on the wait list or considering setting a target or somewhere just a little further upstream of these ones that we have here. And the reason that I think that that's going to be a bigger impact is because most of the companies that we have here are actually all still doing quite a lot for their climate change mitigation work. They still have targets. Their targets are pretty robust. They still have implementation plans. They have running programs to reduce their emissions. And so the extent of their ambition or stated ambition a few years ago may just have been a lot higher than what they were prepared to actually follow through with. But this calibration that they're going through is almost, in my view, inevitable. Like it's not a surprise to me. And so I just see this as a step towards being more realistic. Like, am I happy with it? Do I wish they went more ambitious? Sure, but I kind of assume this was always going to happen, and so I don't think the net reduction in impact is significant. I think, by contrast, the companies that are going to drift away may actually not set anything remotely as robust as an SBT. They may not have anything remotely as robust as an action plan that they would need to meet an SBT, and they might just defer the whole topic for a few years. And I think that actually, because that's going to be a larger mass of companies, I think that's sort of more insidious.
Totally agreed. And I think like behind all of this, we can see a couple macro factors that act as headwinds. So there's been an undeniable ESG backlash, especially in the United States, but also in Europe. The interest rate conditions haven't been as well as the gas prices uh, because of the Russian sanctions. So all of this changed the environment in such a state. Also, we see that there are some challenges that lead to bad targets, which is lack of control on scope 3 emissions and measurements, a lack of financial resources committed to reaching those targets, and a lack of true commitment. Anything else you would want to
Uh,
add, Seth?
I would just say all these things relate to each other, actually. And I would kind of almost just put it down to what is the cost of change? And if you say, hey, capital is cheaper, that means the cost of change is going to be lower. If you say that there is much more sort of positive tailwind, much more momentum towards doing this, much more of an ecosystem supporting you, your investors are for it as well, your customers are for it, the cost of change is going to be lower. And so what we're basically just saying is that the cost of change this year in 2025 is actually higher than it might have been a few years ago. And gas prices, for example, just are one factor playing into it. And I think that's kind of everything that you see represented on the left-hand side here. On the right-hand side, I think there are no real surprises here, but I think all of this could have been obviated or addressed through better planning. Because I think what we're saying is that a lot of the targets that were set over the last few years and a little earlier than that, more or less since 2018, 2019, a lot of those targets assumed that despite not having enough control over implementation, businesses would be able to sort it out because there was enough momentum behind the topic. Despite not having a clear line of sight to how much all of this would cost, business would figure out where the money would come from. And despite not having a really deep-rooted commitment at the level not just of managements and boards, but frankly also shareholders, business would be able to sort it out because there were enough positive vibes. And I think we're just seeing a lot of that turning out to be indefensible against a higher cost of change, basically.
So now we have talked about bad climate goals. Let's talk about what is a good climate goal and how to set it. Obviously, it should be ambitious but realistic and can be achieved and aligned with the Paris Agreement. So how to get there? And I think we see a couple themes is that focused companies who look at a few emission reductions initiatives and focus on those do much better than those that are spread across a lot of areas. There's also something that we call a growth mindset. So companies who look into innovations, new type of product lines, uh, and this ties into the next one, which is it needs to be tied to value. So it cannot be not focused on how this is going to, in the end, provide business value. And we see this like in the shift to circular business models. Uh, it needs to be embedded into the whole life cycle of your product and services in order to make it work. And so one thing that we see currently in the market is that the way companies approach this is they measure their emissions and then they go to a target setting framework, set targets, and then start figuring out how to reach those targets. And That's where it usually goes wrong. And so what we recommend instead is to, after measuring your emissions, just draft targets. So look at the SBTI guidance, look at what that would put you there. And then you need to start developing an action plan. You need to identify the key levers and actions you can make to actually reach that. And with that knowledge, refine and commit to targets that you can actually reach. And then get into a habit of reporting and monitoring those targets.
Yeah, I would just say add on to that, Aron. I think the difference in approach is where one is kind of linear and it's a straight line. And that's the intuitive approach, and that's the approach that many businesses take, which is let me set a target, let me tell everyone what the target is, and then let me figure out how I'm going to get to the target. And the other approach is a little more circular, actually. It's almost like using both hands for the process of like annealing these targets, which means that you're kind of setting a top-down number and you're saying this is the ambition. And you're right to say SBTI is one, SBTs are one way of having those targets. You could be looking at what your peers are doing. You could be looking at what you were like last year or before. There are many approaches that you could take there. And that's this sort of top-down piece of setting the direction of travel and the ambition. But then at more or less the same time and in parallel somewhat, you want to also be bottom upping it as well, where you're building out, well, what would I do? How much would that cost me? How long would it take? How hard would it be? And you're then revisiting the top-down number and you're then revisiting the bottom-up plan. And you're actually going back and forth in a process that might take, several weeks at least, if not a few months, and actually have just a lot of refinement ongoing. But at the end of that, you have the comfort of knowing that you have a reasonable line of sight to what you could achieve. That doesn't mean you have to have 100% of it detailed out, but you should have, I would say, minimum 80% or not, ideally more like 90%, 95% coverage of knowing what you're going to do to achieve your target and how much it's going to cost you and how difficult it's going to be.
Yeah. So just to start with step one, measuring your emissions. I think what really needs to be considered here is how you measure those emissions, because especially with most of the companies we work with, scope one and two, unless they are doing some kind of very heavy industrial processes or chemical processes, it's all kind of clear and well plannable on how to go to renewable energy, electrify heating, and the like. But with scope three, I think companies are underestimating how many emission hotspots that are hard to abate are hidden in their supply chain. And it really needs rigorous measurement and weight-based uh, methodology and very good look at the key products that you purchase from your supply chain in order to understand how to abate that. And so you really need to get this right before you can start thinking about planning actions. Yeah, I think we already talked about what you should use when you draft the climate target. So obviously there are science-based recommendations like the SBTI initiative. In some industries, there are industry-specific bodies. In some countries, there are governmental bodies, so not that many that actually provide guidance on this. And you should always look at your competitive benchmarks. Anything to add there, Seth?
No, I would just say actually I think competitor benchmarks are making a comeback. And so when I was first doing this stuff several years ago, competitor benchmarks were usually the first thing I was recommending. I was actually saying, let's look at what your competitors are doing. And I would actually help companies make a 2x2 chart. And the 2x2 chart would have what is the time frame of your competitor's commitment and what is the ambition level of your competitor's commitment. And I would then plot that on this chart. And you could then say, okay, fine, I'm competing with, Mars, Kellogg's, Danone, whatever my competitors are, and I can kind of see where they all sit on this chart and actually where do I want to land. And that's almost like that's like a pre-SBTI approach or world because it's very subjective. But I actually think that as we've seen a third of our respondents here are looking at alternative target setting approaches. And I actually think that sort of mindset might be making a comeback as well. And so I think what companies should do is make sure that that approach, an alternative SBTI approach, is no less rigorous in its own way. It might be a little less ambitious, but it should be no less rigorous than an SBTI aligned approach. And again, I'm not endorsing a non-science based target. I'm just saying whatever the target is, it should have some methodology, some robustness, and some comparability behind it.
Thank you, Seth. And so once you've drafted your targets, it's time to start developing an action plan. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to take a look at the Altruistiq application and show how we support this. So once you have drafted some kind of commitment, what we recommend is that you then start looking at emissions hotspots. And in the case of food and beverage companies, this will very likely be your sold products emissions and the ingredients and packaging materials coming into these products. So the way that we support this is we offer an initiative modeling capability, which allows you to see the impact of what would happen if you would switch from PET to recycled PET. And so it allows you to model your full output for a given time frame, and this can run up to as long as your targets run, to see what is the current impact associated with your average PET bottle and how much of your production you would shift to recycled PET. You can assign a cost to it. And then that allows you to see what the emissions impact of that will be down the line. And you can see in this example that the emissions associated with the average PET bottle are disappearing, and the recycled PET bottle that's replacing it is significantly lower despite production increasing. We also have you calculate the number of carbon costs, and this allows you to set up a list of initiatives which you can then rank based on their cost and impact, and kind of create an abatement curve to see which are those few that you really need to prioritize in order to reach your targets. And we also allow you to model SBT targets or any custom targets, which kind of use the same mechanism. So we support setting absolute reduction targets or targets based on intensity metrics like $1 million of revenue or tons of chicken produced, whatever your industry or your company needs. And so with this way, you can go back to your targets because now you see what it's going to cost and what it's going to take, and refine and commit to those targets and get into the implementation phase where you monitor and report your progress. Seth, anything
Fantastic.
to add there?
No, I'm conscious we'd wanted to run for about 30 minutes and then open up for Q&A. I think the only final thing I would say here is that the benefit of the approach that Aron outlined for building up your initiatives is that you enable target coverage. And what I mean by that is if you go back to how you build the bottom-up plan, you want to have coverage of 80, 90, 95% of your target at the level of individual initiatives. And those individual initiatives should have a few things for sure. One is a timeline, the second is a cost, and the third is an owner. And ideally, for each of those initiatives, you have these three things, and you build up all the initiatives such that you have 80, 90, 95% coverage for your target by the target deadline. And so having some form of tracking of all those initiatives linked up to your target, we think is essential for target attainment. And that's actually what you would do for any financial plan as well. If you were running a cost-focused transition or transformation in your business, and you were looking to take a certain amount of cost out, which has a lot of good parallels to taking emissions out, then you would want to make sure that you have full coverage in terms of initiatives and owners and timelines and so on at the level of the individual things you're going to do. With that, we want to have time for Q&A now as well. So we're going to I think we already have a couple of questions, in fact, Aron.
I saw a couple, yeah.
Great. Well, let's go over to those to start us off. And so I see. Fun. Okay, fine. Let me start with the first one. I hope it's okay if I name the individuals who have raised the questions. We have one from Jenny. We did the decarbonization plan on an Excel spreadsheet. Um, on an Excel spreadsheet. When is the time to switch to a tool? What are the advantages? Jenny, we see two things happening. One is we see companies switching to tools for emissions measurement. And we also see companies switching to tools for scenario modeling, target management, initiative management. In our case as Altruistiq, we cover both, but it is worth saying that a number of companies are looking for one and not the other, and so on. So I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about both. I would say if you've done your decarbonization plan on an Excel spreadsheet, I would assume that you already have some emissions measurement going on as well. I would say that it depends on how complex your decarbonization plan is, as to whether you need a dedicated tool for initiative management. If you're looking at basically, let's say, 10 or 15 initiatives that you're going to be running, and mostly it's just a few big initiatives run in a few locations, and it's fairly discrete, and it's going to be done across a small time frame, and there are, maybe five or six owners. That's the kind of thing you could probably keep using Excel for. However, let's say that you're actually going to be having 15 or 20 categories of initiatives, and each of those categories will be implemented in 10 or 15 different places by 10 or 15 different people. And you're multiplying that across all the different initiatives that you're going to have, and you have different start dates and end dates. And you also want to have different people, those owners, able to edit and change those initiatives and update them live. Then you're looking at a need for some sort of better digital capability, I would say, because you're going to run into version control issues in your Excel spreadsheet, if nothing else. Just to give you an example, let's say you have a logistics initiative. You could be a single site business and you have a single facility owner, and that single facility owner is going to be in charge of transitioning your fleet upstream, downstream, what have you. And that's like an Excel problem. Or you could actually have 20 locations, 30 locations around the world, and two different types of people managing upstream logistics and downstream. And then all of a sudden, that one category of initiative suddenly becomes much more complex. And in some cases, you're going to do electrified. In some cases, you might be doing hydrogen. In some cases, you might be doing something else. That kind of complexity starts to lead you towards, let's say, a more advanced approach. Um, and then Ryan, let's take Ryan's question around, does Altruistiq come with lots of emissions factor data to inform scenarios? Yes. Aron, I wonder if you want to take this one and I can chime in after.
Yes, obviously. So we integrate almost all of the leading public emission factor sources, some of the private ones as well. So we have EcoInvent, we have a bunch of EPA. Yeah, there's a lot there. We also have our own emission factors, specifically for food and beverages. So we do our own modeling. We work with Joseph Poor from Poor and Nemecek in order to build our farm level emissions modeling. And so we give you a lot of emission factors to model with. And also what we see more and more is that if you're serious about scope 3 reductions, you need to introduce supplier data. So it's not enough to play around with industry specific emission factors. Because one Chinese garment factory is not going to be same as the other. So you need to start collaborating with suppliers and receive emission factors with them and model with those. And that's also something that we support.
Yeah, and then just structurally, the type of switch that you're seeing, which Aaron showed from one type of PET to rPET, it follows the emissions factor. So basically, the emissions data is feeding through for that particular activity. It's feeding through from the emissions tracking that's happening. And that's associated with a particular type of emissions factor, that calculation for that activity. And then the switch is associated with an alternative emissions factor. And that's how the tool will calculate what the delta is as well. So it sort of follows the emissions factor of the activity. And then great, let's go on with Humberto's question from Costa Rica. What is your advice on pushing decision makers and executives to focus more on data-driven sustainability efforts for decision making, with the ultimate goal of setting precise and data-based climate goals? And please focus on developing countries or less developed regions. Super happy to do that. I would say that there are some principles that are true regardless of whether you're in an emerging market or a developed market. And those principles are any good decision makers in your business will want to look at the data and the cost implications and the upside. And so I would say the fundamentals of a good business case apply to every business, which is if you want to push decision makers towards undertaking a climate goal or doing a bunch of initiatives, those initiatives and that goal need to come with a business case of some sort that factors in what is the potential upside and what is the cost and what is the expected implementation plan and how hard is this going to be. You may not be able to do that to the 99th percentile of accuracy, but you should at least have some ballpark and some idea of how far off you might be. So, for example, we worked with a large packaging company in South Asia, and it was it was about maybe doing $600-700 million revenue, and it was owner operated. And as part of the board presentation, you have to go with what is the emissions number in this business today, and you then have to also say, well, what do we think the reason is for change? Why are we talking about action here? And so we talked in that case about the big customers for that packaging company, which were FMCGs. And then we say, what would change look like in terms of the initiatives? And then we talk about, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 of the big initiatives that business might have to do, which in this case was a lot of focus on site renewable energy, and alternative materials and recycled content and so on. And then you say, well, which of these are likely to be going to be most expensive? What does that expensiveness look like? When might we have to do it? And you start sort of talking through this, and the benefit of that is that's a very familiar sort of dialogue to decision makers everywhere in every sort of business, which means that you're at least speaking the same language. So I would always take that approach to start with. Um, Going on to another question from Pritu, we were evaluating whether SBTI commitments were right for us, and as we were on the path to submission. And as we were on the process of submission, they've added flag requirements. How long do current companies have to submit that data? This seems to have added additional complexity to the data, which will delay us being able to do this fast. I hear you, Preetu. Most companies, almost every company in the food and beverage space is in the same boat, and the boat is complicated, and there's a few complications. One is that the SBTI guidance came out before the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance was finalized. And so you kind of have some idea of what the SBTI target might look like, but not really a full idea of what the accounting would look like to support it, which is complicated, and happy to talk more about that separately as well. Um, I think the thing with flag, though, if I was to say why the complexity is useful, is that what you need to do to meet flag requirements is also what you will need to do to understand your initiatives better. Because the main focus of flag requirements is around switching to weights from spend, understanding locations for sourcing, understanding activities involved in the locations that are supplying you. These are probably the three main complexities that flag-based SBTI targets introduce. And these three things are things that you would have to do anyway to understand what your change plan or your implementation plan might look like. It's also, once you get into the weeds of doing it, it's not actually as hard as you might expect for businesses that have a reasonable idea of what goes into their products. And this is true for most food and beverage businesses because of country of origin requirements and so on as well. So my main thing would be, my main response would be to say, I agree, it's definitely made stuff more complicated. At the same time, that complexity is probably what you would have had to do anyway over the next year or two as you move towards target attainment. Let's move over to Alex's question. What is the main incentive for a global corporation to set targets? Why don't we see strong government subsidies for climate reductions, as we've seen in the past years for renewable energy projects deployment? This is a good question. Let me maybe list off a few incentives that I see. I tend to focus on business incentives rather than save the world incentives. And that's because I am am the survivor of a few failed NGOs that I started in the past, which ignored business incentives and have learned since then to always treat business incentives as the gospel truth. And so let's start with B2B and then let's talk about B2C. I'll try and do maybe 30 seconds or a minute on each. So on the B2B context, there's a bunch of reasons right now. If you are selling products to other customers, increasingly those customers are going to be looking for ways that your product differentiates. The standard procurement conversation that happens between you and your customers is focused on price, quality, time to delivery, and cash and payment terms. Those are a few things. Those are the usual bread and butter of your sale and procurement discussions with your customers. Sustainability gives every B2B company another lens to focus on. It's almost like a new type of quality. You can start talking about the impact that this product might have on the footprint of the customer. What is the impact that this product might have on the achievement of the targets of your customer? I know that many businesses in the B2B space have said that that dialogue does not seem to be as well rewarded as they would have expected, meaning that their customers are not willing to pay them more. But that's missing the point, actually. What we see from most of the companies that we work with on supply chain engagement is that they are not happy to pay more for a sustainable product yet, but they are actually happy to talk about longer term contracts. They are actually happy to talk about larger volume commitments. And those two things have very significant value for a B2B business. And so I would say that if you're in a B2B company, having an internal dialogue with your stakeholders around what would new sustainable product lines look like, what are the commercial benefits of that in terms of volume, longevity of the relationship, share of wallet, etc. And how do we actually use that to create a holistic picture for what our business should be doing? I would say that's probably the main incentive that I see right now. On a B2C side, I think it depends a little on whether you're a challenger or an incumbent. If you're a challenger, let's say you're like an Oatly or a Flora Food Group, or you're a business that is trying to take market share away from an incumbent by competing at the category level, you're saying this product is inherently more sustainable, the one that I'm selling, then actually sustainability is woven into the DNA of the narrative that you're trying to go for. And I would say it is just a core part of your commercial strategy, and that should be the incentive. If you're an incumbent, you are a large FMCG or similar, you have a big stable of brands, for example, I would say that you're actually making a defensive play against the challenger. And the need here is to understand your customer segment better at the micro market level. And by that I mean, if you look at, let's say, let's take a Unilever, right, or a Nestle, they're serving every consumer on earth, but basically, right? It's the full market, and the full market is going to tell you that actually a lot of consumers care about sustainability, but not enough of them are willing to pay for it. That doesn't really give you much. But if you start looking at these micro markets and you say, well, actually, what if I look at urban consumers in London or in New York of a certain age group buying a certain product out of my stable of products, you start to see much more nuance. And so I would build the case of incentives from there. There's a good second question you have around government subsidies. I don't think we're going to see a lot of that over the next 4 years. It's not just a US thing. I think it's unlikely to be across Europe as well. And I think that just relates to the cost of capital. I think when we start to see interest rates go down quite considerably, when we start to see inflation a lot more under control than it is, I think we'll start to have that conversation come back up. Question from Jenny on SBTI. Why is the food industry not feeling much more pressure from retail with regards to setting SBTs? Retail could definitely, Jenny, have put more pressure on industry. I think that there's like a bunch of things that go into this. One is that retail has a difficult business model in general right now. Like if you look at how most retailers' financial performances have gone over the last year, it's been a difficult market for retail. There is very little appetite in retail for anything that costs more, anything that creates a lot more friction. And most suppliers will want retail to pay something for it. What we are seeing is some pressure on the edges. I was actually in a conversation just a week or two ago with a big packaging company that was talking about how some of their retailers had said, look, we are phasing out single-use plastic by X date altogether. If you want your products to be on our shelves, you're going to have a plan for how you're going to phase that out. And actually that drove a change in how the business operates. And so I think that that sort of thing is still happening. It's happening much more driven by certain retailers than others. But I think in general, my observation is most of retail is waiting for someone else to solve the problem because this is just one more thing that they're not prepared to deal with right now. In their defense, I would say they've had a very difficult few years really as an industry. And so I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. Conscious we're heading over time now. Let's try and do the last couple of them rapid fire. Philippe's question on involving all stakeholders on decarbonization is a major challenge. Do you recommend a certificate or other which could bring team members up to speed on these issues and provide knowledge to use the tool you've presented? Good question. Let us think on that and get back to you offline, Philippe. I think there will be a few that we recommend, but it is not a great space. Like the quality, I would say, of education, knowledge, and so on in this area is not what I would have wanted to see. So, an unfortunate caveat there. And then another question on how can the new Trump administration affect climate targets set in the last years for US-based companies? I I think that what we're going to see is some sort of a tightening around commitments from US companies. What I mean by that is the big businesses or the sustainability leaders that are already well advanced on this, those that are US based, I actually think that there might be a small step back across many of them. Like, I think they will still by and large stay the course. I think they will still do most of what they're doing. I think that there will be just a little less oomph behind it. Like it might mean that the target is a little lower. It might mean that they're spending a bit less. It might mean that they're talking about it a bit less. But I think you will see a bit of a step back. But largely, I think that they're going to stay the course. Those of them that are global businesses exposed to European regulation as well, exposed to Californian regulation, exposed to a lot of brand risk. I think that they're, generally going to stay the course, but I think you will see a sort of a tightening up a little of what they're doing. I think that there are a bunch of companies on the fringes, and these are the ones that I would say came into the tent because the cost of capital was lower, the cost of change was lower, and there was a lot more positive momentum in the broader ecosystem. I think a lot of, let's say, mid-sized businesses, businesses that weren't really very environmentally exposed but wanted to be part of the wave. A lot of these companies, I think, kind of came into the tent over the last few years, and I think those companies will actually drift away is what I would expect. Um, that said, the thing about climate change is it's a growth industry. It is only getting worse, and the need is only going to get bigger. Now, that's obviously a horrible thing for us to face up to as a civilization. At the same time, it means, in my view, that most companies are going to come back into this tent at some point over the coming years. Conscious, we ran a few minutes over time, but that was a fantastic set of questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed this dialogue, really, or this conversation with you guys.